Hello, boys and girls. Welcome to session 7 for reading. I will be your host, Miss Embling. Oh, thank you. That's so sweet this morning. What a warm welcome. You guys must be ready to dig right into your reading. I am too. We are actually just about done with The Absent Author, which is great. I'm assuming that many of you are just about done with your mystery book, and I know some of you have already finished. If you finish your mystery book, you brought home hopefully 2 or 3. You can hop right into the next one. Or if you are completely done with your paper books, you can go on to Storia or Epic, any of those online libraries that you're familiar with from your classroom, and search in mystery, and you should get a whole bunch of them. Pick one that's a just right book for you and start reading that one. Oh, I think there's a question. Yes, Kathy. What if I have to do a response about suspects and I just started a new book? What do I do? Oh, great question, Kathy. What you can do is go ahead and respond that day to your teacher, but tell them, hey, I just started a new book today called The Dinosaur Bone Mystery. I don't have any suspects yet. And your teacher will take that, no problem. And then you'll have a little bit of time to read before the next response and hopefully can just hop back in. All right, so all of that aside, I am ready to go and read chapter 8. But before I do, I think we should recap chapter 7. Oh, another question? Yes, Rebecca. Recap? You said recap. I know visualizing and inferring. I know summarizing. I know author's craft. Yeah, what do you... I never heard of recap. Oh, good. Let me help you out with that, because that's actually one of the strategies I want to teach you today. So, recap means to kind of review or kind of summarize. And when you recap a chapter, it's going to be very short. You're going to take the main event from that chapter and kind of, I like to jot it down in a Post-it. So for chapter 7, I recap chapter 7. Like I said, it's so short it fits on a Post-it. So for chapter 7, it says, Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose ate lunch and figured out that their mystery clues lead to the rooms 302 and 303. Now that should hopefully jog your memory and you'll be like, oh yeah, they were eating and there was cookies and the lemonade got spilt on Dink. We don't need to write all of those things. A lot of those things will come back to your memory when you read what you read here, which is the main event in the chapter. All right, so knowing that, we're going to go ahead and read chapter 8. And instead of you watching me, I'm going to let you look at the picture for chapter 8. I've noticed that, there we go. I've noticed that in Ron Roy's books, or in the A to Z Mysteries, there's usually about 1 picture per chapter. And that picture usually kind of hints at the main event for the chapter. So chapter 8. Dink's jeans were nearly dry by the time they reached the hotel. Mavis was waiting out front. How was your lunch? She asked timidly. Fine, thanks, Dink said. We talked it over and we think there's something fishy going on the 3rd floor of this hotel. Suddenly Mavis began coughing. She held up her scarf in front of her mouth. Dink noticed that the letters on the scarf were tiny M's. Are you okay? He asked. Should I run in and get you some water? Asked Josh. Mavis took off her glasses and shook her head. No, I'm fine, thank you. Dear me, I don't know what happened. Now, what were you saying about the 3rd floor? We think Wallace Wallace may be up there, Ruth Rose said. She reminded Mavis about the smudge signature for room 302 and the Do Not Disturb sign on the door. Mavis replaced her eyeglasses. Mercy, what do you think we should do? Follow me, Dink said. For a second time, they all trooped into the hotel lobby. Mr. Linkletter watched them from behind the counter. Hi, Dink said. Remember us? Vividly, Mr. Linkletter said. Wallace Wallace checked into room 303, right? That is correct, said Mr. Linkletter. Well, we talked to the maid who cleaned that room, Dink went on, and she told us no one slept in it. You spoke to Olivia Nugent? When? How? We have our ways, Josh said. So, Dink went on, we think Wallace Wallace disappeared right here in the hotel. And Wallace Wallace is a very famous writer, Ruth Rose reminded Mr. Linkletter. Millions of kids are waiting to read his next book, she added. Mr. Linkletter's eyes grew large. He swallowed and his Adam's apple bobbed up and down in his neck. He rubbed his forehead as though he had a headache. Then Dink told Mr. Linkletter about room 302. Miss Nugent said there was a Do Not Disturb sign on the door. Ruth Rose pointed to the register. See, the signature's all smudged. We think the kidnappers are hiding Wallace Wallace in that room, Josh said. At the word kidnappers, Mr. Linkletter closed his eyes. He opened a drawer and he took out a bottle of headache pills and put one on his tongue. Just to be on the safe side, perhaps we should check both rooms, Mavis said quietly. It'll just take a minute, Dink said. Mr. Linkletter let out a big sigh. Very well, but this is most unusual. Things run very smoothly at the Shangri-La. They all got into the elevator. No one spoke. Dink watched Mr. Linkletter jingling his bunch of keys. Mr. Linkletter kept his eyes on the little arrow telling them which floor they were on. The elevator door opened on the 3rd floor. Mr. Linkletter unlocked room 303. Most unusual, he muttered. The room was empty and spotlessly clean. Strange, very strange, Mr. Linkletter said. They moved to room 302 where a Do Not Disturb sign hung on the doorknob. Mr. Linkletter knocked. They all leaned towards the door. Listen, I hear a voice, Josh said. What's it saying? Ruth Rose asked. Then they all heard it. The voice was muffled, but it was definitely yelling, Help! All right, that can't be good. Somebody yelling for help in the room? Eek! All right, so if you remember, our strategy for today is pausing at the end of each chapter to recap it. Okay, so we're just at the end of chapter 8. We're taking a quick pause to think about what's the main event that happened, and then are there any small details that really matter in that chapter? That chapter is an easy one to recap. What did they do? What's the main event? They were checking out kind of their biggest clue, room 302 and 303. So to recap that chapter, I put room 303 is clean and empty, and someone is yelling for help in 302. All right, we're going right into chapter 9. I didn't want to make you wait too long. Mr. Linkletter unlocked the door and shoved it open. A man with curly blonde hair stared back at them. He was sitting in a chair with his feet tied in front of him. His arms were tied behind his back and a towel was wrapped around his mouth. Oh my goodness, Mr. Linkletter cried. Everyone rushed into the room. Dink ran behind the chair to untie the man's hand while Josh untied his feet. Mavis unwrapped the towel from around his face. Thank goodness you got here, the man said. I'm Wallace Wallace. Someone knocked on my door last night. A voice said he was from room service, but when I opened the door, 2 men dragged me in here and tied me up. He looked at Dink. You're Dink Duncan. I recognize you from the picture you sent. How did you find me? We followed your itinerary, Dink said. He showed Mr. Wallace the sheet of paper. We got it from Mr. Paskey and we used it as a trail. The trail led us to this room. I'm so sorry I missed the book signing, Wallace said. As you can see, well, I was a bit tied up. He smiled. Then he rubbed his jaw. My mouth is sore from that towel. I can't believe I was kidnapped, and I can't wait to get back to my safe little cottage in Maine. Can you describe the 2 guys who kidnapped you? Dink asked. We should tell Officer Fallon and he can try to find them. Wallace stared at Dink. The 2 guys? Oh, well, I don't think I'll... Hey! Ruth Rose suddenly yelled. Everyone looked at her. What's the matter? Asked Dink. You look funny, Ruth Rose. Ruth Rose was staring at the red scarf draped around Mavis's neck. She pointed at the man who'd been tied up. You're not Wallace. Then she looked at Mavis Green. You are, she said quietly. What? Did you all catch that? Let me read that last part again. Ruth Rose was staring at the red scarf draped around Mavis's neck. She pointed at the man who'd been tied up. You're not Wallace, she said. Then she looked at Mavis Green. You are, she said quietly. What? All right, and that's actually where I'm going to stop. We are so close to the end of the book. It's kind of torture, but we'll get to it. What I want you to do right now is try to predict what I might write for Chapter 9. If I had to recap the main event in Chapter 9, what would I write? Think about it for a minute. All right, let's see if this is what you put. Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose found a man tied up in room 302. Ruth Rose says, Mavis is Wallace. So So I recapped the chapter with the main event. They found that man tied up. But I also thought that little detail at the very end, when she said, "You're not Wallace Wallace," and she looked at Mavis and said, "You are," seems kind of important. So I included both of those things. See, it still fits on a post-it. So now I've done chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9. I wrote about 3 sentences, not too bad. If I was doing this through the whole book, it'd be kind of nice for me to be able to put them almost like a little timeline, kind of like mapping out the events in your book. So I'd have chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9. All right. Imagine having that from your whole book. That'd really help you hold on to the book a little bit longer. All right. Are you ready to try this recapping strategy? Here's your homework. You're not really working anywhere but home, are you? Here's what you're going to do for your response today. After you read the next chapter in your book, pause. Think about what was the main event in that chapter, and are there any small details that are worth mentioning? And then on your Google Doc, recap your chapter for your teacher. It's going to be short, all right? But make sure that you're specific and you're still using capital letters and punctuation. So don't just say, "They did this," or "they went and got stuff." Tell me who it was and what they got, okay? So the main event of your next chapter, recap it for your teacher in your Google Doc. Good luck with this strategy, and keep it in mind anytime you read a long book, it'll help you hold all the information while you're reading. All right. Thanks, guys.